What happens when America's most beloved pop icon comes face to face with one of television's most relentless interrogators? You won't believe what unfolds when Cher sits down with George Stephanopoulos, expecting a lighthearted conversation about her legendary career, only to find herself trapped in a political minefield that would leave viewers speechless and the entertainment world buzzing. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is the moment when Hollywood glamour collided with Washington ruthlessness, creating television gold that no one saw coming. The stage was set for what should have been a triumphant return to daytime television for the goddess of pop, Cher, radiant in a flowing black ensemble that seemed to shimmer under the studio lights, settled into the familiar chair across from Stephanopoulos, with the confidence of someone who had conquered every stage from Vegas to Broadway. Her iconic hair cascaded perfectly over one shoulder, and that famous smile, the one that had launched 1,000 magazine covers, beamed across the set as she adjusted her statement jewelry with practiced elegance. "Cher, welcome back," Stephanopoulos began, his trademark composed demeanor masking what would soon reveal itself as a carefully orchestrated ambush. "It's always a pleasure to have you here." The legendary performer leaned back slightly, her expressive eyes sparkling with the kind of warmth that had endeared her to generations of fans. "George, honey, it's so good to be back. You know I love coming on the show. We always have such great conversations." But something in Stephanopoulos' expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a subtle tightening around his eyes that seasoned television watchers might have recognized as the precursor to trouble. His hands, folded neatly on the desk between them, seemed to grip just a fraction tighter as he prepared to steer the conversation in a direction that would catch his unsuspecting guest completely off guard. "Speaking of great conversations," he continued, his voice taking on that particular tone that had made him both feared and respected in political circles, "I want to talk about some of your recent comments regarding the current administration's policies on women's rights." Cher's smile faltered for just a moment, a barely perceptible flutter that would later be dissected frame by frame across social media platforms. She had come prepared to discuss her upcoming album, her thoughts on turning 80, perhaps even share a few behind-the-scenes stories from her recent performances. Political discourse, especially the kind of confrontational journalism that Stephanopoulos was known for, wasn't on her agenda for this particular Tuesday afternoon. "Well, George," she replied, her voice maintaining its characteristic rasp, but gaining a slight edge, "I think any woman with a brain and a conscience has concerns about what's happening to our rights in this country. I mean, we're literally watching decades of progress being rolled back." The studio audience, initially buzzing with the excitement of being in the presence of a living legend, began to sense the shift in atmosphere. Cameras caught several audience members exchanging glances, their expressions transforming from anticipation to uncertainty as they realized they were witnessing something far more intense than the typical celebrity promotion they had expected. Stephanopoulos leaned forward, his journalist instincts fully engaged now, like a predator who had detected vulnerability in his prey. "But Cher, don't you think some of your social media posts have been, let's say, inflammatory? Last month you called certain political figures fascist wannabes and suggested that women should rise up and fight. Some critics argue that kind of language contributes to political division rather than constructive dialogue." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and viewers could practically see Cher's defenses rising in real time. Her posture straightened, her chin lifted with the kind of defiance that had carried her through decades in an industry notorious for chewing up and spitting out female performers. This was the same woman who had survived being dismissed as just Sonny's wife, who had reinvented herself as an actress, a pop icon, and a cultural force of nature. She wasn't about to be intimidated by a television host, no matter how accomplished. "Inflammatory?" she repeated, her voice climbing in both volume and intensity. "George, I've been fighting for women's rights since before some of these politicians were even born. When I see old white men making decisions about women's bodies, when I see young girls being told they have fewer rights than their grandmothers did, you're damn right I'm going to speak up. And if that makes some people uncomfortable, well, maybe they should examine why the truth bothers them so much." The studio had grown noticeably quieter, the kind of electric silence that precedes a storm. Production assistants moved nervously behind the cameras, unsure whether they were witnessing great television or a complete disaster. Stephanopoulos, however, seemed energized by the confrontation, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a journalist who had successfully rattled his subject. But using terms like fascist, he pressed on, clearly unwilling to let the matter drop. Don't you think that's hyperbolic? Don't you think that kind of rhetoric actually undermines your message? Cher's famous composure was beginning to crack, and the cameras captured every micro-expression as her legendary patience started to wear thin. Her hands, adorned with the rings that had become part of her iconic image, gripped the arms of her chair as she leaned forward to meet Stephanopoulos' challenging gaze head-on. Hyperbolic? She shot back, her voice taking on the kind of fire that had made her one of the most formidable performers of her generation. George, when politicians are actively working to strip away fundamental rights, when they're using the same playbook as authoritarian regimes throughout history, calling it what it is isn't hyperbolic, it's honest. And maybe if more people in your position were willing to be honest instead of hiding behind false equivalencies and both sidesism, we wouldn't be in this mess. The accusation struck like lightning, and viewers could see Stephanopoulos' professional mask slip for just an instant. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and the carefully controlled expression he was known for flickered with something that looked suspiciously like anger. This was no longer a standard celebrity interview. This was becoming a battle of wills between two strong personalities, each unwilling to back down. I think I've been quite honest in my reporting, he replied, his voice carrying a chill that seemed to drop the studio temperature by several degrees. But I'm curious, Cher, given your criticism of political rhetoric, how do you reconcile your own use of charged language with your calls for unity and understanding? The question was clearly designed to put her on the defensive, to make her appear hypocritical or contradictory. It was the kind of gotcha journalism that had made Stephanopoulos both successful and, among some circles, deeply resented. But if he expected Cher to crumble under the pressure, he had seriously underestimated the woman sitting across from him. You know what, George? She said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level that somehow seemed more threatening than if she had been shouting. I think there's a difference between speaking truth and playing games. When I call out injustice, I'm speaking from the heart, from experience, from a place of genuine concern for my fellow human beings. When certain people in positions of power use inflammatory language, they're doing it to divide, to conquer, to distract from their own failures. The tension in the studio was now palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Even the usually invisible production crew seemed frozen in place, afraid that any movement might shatter the increasingly fragile peace between host and guest. This was clearly escalating beyond anything anyone had anticipated, and there was a sense that they were all witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. But Stephanopoulos wasn't finished. With the persistence that had made him a formidable political interviewer, he continued to push, seemingly oblivious to, or perhaps enjoying, the growing hostility from his increasingly agitated guest. Let's talk about your recent endorsements, he said, pulling out a tablet with what appeared to be prepared notes, a clear indication that this line of questioning wasn't spontaneous but carefully orchestrated. You've been very vocal about supporting certain candidates, but some of your choices have been controversial. How do you respond to critics who say that celebrities like yourself should stay out of politics altogether? The question hit like a slap across the face, and Cher's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her head snapped back slightly, her eyes widening with a mixture of disbelief and outrage that seemed to ripple through her entire body. The suggestion that she, a woman who had used her platform for decades to advocate for marginalized communities, who had visited troops overseas, who had put her money where her mouth was on countless social causes, should somehow remain silent on issues that affected millions of Americans, was clearly the last straw. Are you kidding me right now? She demanded, her voice rising to a level that made several audience members visibly flinch. Celebrities should stay out of politics? George, I've been paying taxes in this country probably longer than you've been alive. I've employed thousands of people. I've donated millions to charitable causes. I've used my platform to shine light on issues that matter. But somehow, because I can sing and act, my opinion is worth less than some trust fund baby who bought his way into office? The studio lights seemed to intensify the heat radiating from both participants as Stephanopoulos adjusted his position, clearly relishing the reaction he had provoked. His expression remained professionally neutral, but there was something predatory in his eyes. The look of a hunter who had successfully cornered his prey and was now moving in for the kill. "I'm not saying your opinion is worth less," he replied, with a kind of calculated calm that was clearly designed to infuriate. "But don't you think there's a responsibility that comes with your influence? When you have millions of followers hanging on your every word, shouldn't you be more careful about the messages you're putting out there?" "Careful about what messages?" Cher shot back, her voice cracking with emotion. "That women deserve bodily autonomy? That people shouldn't be discriminated against because of who they love? That children shouldn't go hungry in the richest country in the world? Which of those messages, exactly, do you think I should be more careful about, George?" The confrontation was spiraling beyond anything the production team had anticipated. Behind the cameras, producers were frantically whispering into headsets, unsure whether to intervene or let the drama play out. This was no longer an interview, it was becoming a public battlefield where two fundamentally different worldviews were clashing with explosive intensity. Stephanopoulos leaned back in his chair, his body language suggesting he was completely in control despite the chaos he had unleashed. "I think what concerns some people is the divisive nature of your rhetoric. Just last week, you posted that anyone who doesn't share your political views is either evil or stupid. Don't you see how that kind of statement alienates people who might otherwise be open to dialogue?" The accusation was like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire. Cher's face flushed with anger, her hands now gripping the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. The woman who had gracefully navigated decades of show business politics, who had survived personal scandals and professional setbacks with dignity and humor, was now being pushed to her absolute breaking point on national television. "That's not what I said, and you know it," she exploded, her voice echoing through the studio with such force that even the cameramen seemed to step back. "I said that anyone who looks at children being separated from their families at the border and thinks that's okay is either lacking in compassion or lacking in information. I said that anyone who thinks a woman seeking an abortion after being raped should be forced to carry that pregnancy to term is either cruel or ignorant. Don't you dare twist my words to fit your narrative." The studio audience was now completely silent, some covering their mouths in shock, others pulling out phones to capture what was clearly becoming a historic television moment. The energy in the room had shifted from uncomfortable tension to something approaching genuine fear. Fear that this confrontation was about to explode into something even more dramatic and unpredictable. But if Stephanopoulos felt any concern about the direction things were heading, he showed no sign of it. Instead, he pressed forward with the relentless determination of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, seemingly determined to push his guest past any remaining boundaries of civility or restraint. "But, Cher," he continued, his voice taking on an almost patronizing tone that seemed calculated to maximize offense, "when you use your platform to attack people's character rather than their policies, when you question their intelligence or their morality simply because they disagree with you, aren't you contributing to the very toxicity you claim to oppose?" The suggestion that she was somehow responsible for political toxicity, she, who had spent her career championing the underdog, fighting for equality, using her voice to defend those who had no voice of their own, was apparently the final insult Cher was willing to tolerate. Her entire demeanor changed in that moment, transforming from frustrated celebrity to righteous warrior, her eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to illuminate the entire studio. "You want to talk about toxicity?" she snarled, leaning forward until she was almost across the desk from him. "How about the toxicity of sitting in your comfortable chair, pretending to be objective while you give platforms to people who want to strip away basic human rights?" How about the toxicity of false equivalencies, of treating lies and truth as if they're just different opinions? How about the toxicity of journalists, who are more interested in creating controversy than informing the public? The words hung in the air like an indictment, and for the first time in the interview, Stephanopoulos seemed genuinely taken aback. His carefully controlled expression flickered with something that looked suspiciously like genuine anger, and the professional mask he had worn throughout his career appeared to be slipping in real time. "I think you're out of line," he said, his voice carrying a cold edge that made the temperature in the studio seem to drop several degrees. "I've spent my career asking tough questions of people in power, holding them accountable regardless of their political affiliation. If you can't handle that level of scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be weighing in on political matters." The dismissive tone, the suggestion that she couldn't handle tough questions, the implication that her decades of activism and advocacy were somehow illegitimate. It was a perfect storm of condescension that seemed designed to provoke the most explosive possible response. And Cher, pushed beyond her limits by what she clearly saw as an unfair and biased attack, was about to give him exactly what he was asking for. "Can't handle scrutiny?" she repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow seemed more threatening than if she had been screaming. "George, I've been handling scrutiny since before you knew what journalism was. I've been torn apart by critics, dismissed by executives, underestimated by politicians, and written off by people who thought a girl from El Centro couldn't make it in this world. But I'm still here, and I'm still fighting, and I'm not about to be silenced by some pompous little man who thinks he can intimidate me with his fancy questions and his holier-than-thou attitude." The insult hit Stephanopoulos like a physical blow, and for the first time in the entire confrontation, his professional composure completely cracked. His face flushed red, his jaw clenched visibly, and his hands formed tight fists on the desk between them. The careful neutrality he had maintained throughout his career evaporated in an instant, replaced by raw, undisguised fury that transformed his entire appearance. "Pompous little man?" he sputtered, his voice rising to match hers in intensity. "I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, Nobel Prize winners, people who actually matter in shaping policy and global events. You're a singer, Cher. You make pop music and appear in sequin dresses. The fact that you think your opinion carries the same weight as actual experts and elected officials shows exactly how delusional Hollywood has become." The studio erupted. Several audience members gasped audibly, others began murmuring in shock, and a few actually stood up as if preparing to leave. The cameramen exchanged horrified glances, unsure whether they should keep rolling or cut away from what was rapidly becoming a complete meltdown of professional broadcasting standards. Behind the scenes, producers were frantically gesturing, but nobody seemed to know how to stop the runaway train this interview had become. Cher's reaction was immediate and volcanic. She shot to her feet with such force that her chair rolled backward, her entire body trembling with rage as she towered over the desk that separated them. Her eyes blazed with decades of accumulated fury. Fury at being dismissed, at being underestimated, at being reduced to nothing more than a singer in sequined dresses by someone who clearly had no understanding of her journey, her struggles, or her contributions to society. "How dare you?" she roared, her voice echoing through the studio with such power that it seemed to make the very walls shake. "How dare you sit there and dismiss what I've accomplished, what I've survived, what I've built with my own two hands? You think because you went to fancy schools and got handed opportunities that you're somehow more qualified to speak about the human condition than someone who's actually lived it?" Stephanopoulos had clearly crossed a line he couldn't uncross, but his own anger seemed to have overridden any sense of professional judgment he might have possessed. He leaned forward aggressively, his voice dripping with condescension as he launched his most devastating attack yet. "What you've lived," he sneered. "Cher, you've lived in a bubble of wealth and privilege for 50 years. You have no idea what real Americans are going through, what real families face when they're struggling to pay their bills or keep their businesses afloat. You perform on stage, you pose for photos, you tweet from your mansion, And somehow you think that qualifies you to lecture the rest of us about morality and politics? The accusation was so far from reality, so completely divorced from the truth of Cher's actual life and experiences, that it seemed to momentarily rob her of speech. She stood frozen for a heartbeat, her mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had just heard. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached down and picked up her purse from beside her chair, her movements so controlled and purposeful that they were more intimidating than any outburst could have been. "You know what, George?" she said, her voice now deadly calm in a way that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. "I've met a lot of small, petty people in my life. People who thought they could tear me down to make themselves feel bigger. People who thought that because I was a woman, because I didn't come from money, because I didn't have the right connections or the right education, I didn't deserve respect or consideration." She slung her purse over her shoulder with practiced elegance, every movement deliberate and dignified despite the chaos surrounding her. The studio lights caught the sequins on her outfit, the very sequins Stephanopoulos had mocked, making her seem to shimmer with an otherworldly power as she prepared to deliver her final verdict. "But you, George," she continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment, "you're something special. You're the kind of person who thinks intelligence means being able to ask gotcha questions, who thinks power means being able to tear down people who are trying to make the world better. You sit in your little chair, playing your little games, thinking you're important because you can make people uncomfortable on television." The entire studio had fallen into absolute silence, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something historic, not just the breakdown of an interview, but the complete demolition of a television host's credibility in real time. Stephanopoulos sat frozen, his face cycling through expressions of rage, shock, and something that looked suspiciously like fear, as Cher continued her devastating monologue. "But here's what you don't understand," she said, taking a step toward the exit, while keeping her gaze fixed on him like a laser. "Real power isn't about tearing people down, it's about lifting them up. Real intelligence isn't about asking clever questions, it's about having the wisdom to know when you're wrong. And real journalism isn't about creating conflict for ratings, it's about seeking truth and serving the public good." She turned toward the studio exit, then paused and looked back over her shoulder with the kind of withering look that had intimidated directors, executives, and critics for decades. Her final words were delivered with such precise, cutting clarity that they seemed to slice through the air like a blade. "I came here today thinking I was going to have a conversation with a professional journalist," she said, her voice carrying perfectly to every corner of the stunned studio. "Instead, I find myself being attacked by a bitter little man who's so desperate for relevance that he thinks ambushing his guests makes him important. Well, congratulations, George. You've just shown everyone watching exactly what kind of person you really are." With that, she turned and began walking toward the exit with her head held high, her posture radiating the kind of dignity that comes from knowing you've taken the moral high ground. Behind her, Stephanopoulos sat in stunned silence, his face pale and his mouth working soundlessly as if he couldn't quite process what had just happened to him. "Cher, wait," he called out weakly, finally seeming to realize that he had pushed things too far, that he had created a public relations disaster that would follow him for the rest of his career. But his words fell on deaf ears. She didn't look back, didn't acknowledge his desperate attempt at damage control. Instead, she walked through the studio doors with the same regal bearing that had carried her through 5 decades of triumphs and setbacks, leaving behind a shell-shocked host, a stunned audience, and television footage that would be analyzed, debated, and replayed for years to come. The studio remained in absolute silence for several long seconds after her departure, as if everyone present needed time to process what they had just witnessed. Cameras continued rolling, capturing Stephanopoulos' obvious distress as he sat alone at his desk, the victory he had thought he was achieving, having turned into complete and utter defeat. When the show finally cut to commercial, the damage was already done. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation would be circulating on social media, with overwhelming public support rallying behind Cher and fierce criticism directed at Stephanopoulos' unprofessional conduct. The interview that was supposed to be a routine promotional appearance had instead become a defining moment, not just for both participants, but for anyone who witnessed the spectacular collision between authentic passion and manufactured controversy. In the end, Cher had done what she had always done throughout her legendary career. She had stood her ground, spoken her truth, and walked away with her dignity intact, leaving her adversary to face the consequences of his own actions. The goddess of pop had once again proven that real power comes not from tearing others down, but from refusing to be torn down yourself.